Welcome everybody to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion of children, families and community. Today we're going to be focusing on some underpinning theory to help us deconstruct the many influences that impact children, families and our local communities. Taking a theoretical perspective is a really important analytical lens to help us see the many societal and political influences that surround children, families and the professional practice of educators and those working closely with children and families. Of course, there are many theories relevant to child development and the social context that are actual seminal pieces of work. And while we will briefly explore some and thread those theoretical perspectives throughout the rest of the unit, today we're going to be primarily exploring Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. This theory provides a relevant and really helpful framework for us to examine children and family positioning within the broader context of community, society and time. However, as we progress through this unit, we will be drawing on other theories such as social constructivism and critical theory to assist us in deconstructing and critically analysing our current values and beliefs, the existing power relationships between adults and governments towards children and families. So let's begin to take a closer look at some of those really relevant aspects of Bronfenbrenner's theory that are going to help us along the way. One of the oldest theoretical debates relevant to the human condition has been that of nature versus nurture. Which is more impactful on child development, the inherent characteristics children are born with, or the environment in which they live and grow? And for many decades, this academic debate was hotly contested, with many theorists and researchers focused on providing a definitive answer to this question. However, in more contemporary decades, the debate has moderated to recognise that it's a really complex interplay between both. The innate characteristics children are born with and the environment in all of its complexities work together to shape the developmental outcomes of children. In this unit, while we absolutely recognise the impact of children's overall biological characteristics and how that plays out in their developmental outcomes, we will be focusing on the role of context and exploring the many direct and subtle impacts that context has for young children and their families. I'd like you to consider this question that I've drawn directly from your text. How do the circumstances and social conditions of a child's life influence their learning and behaviour and growth? We know that children live in really diverse contexts and situations that have varied lived experiences, but how do these things impact their development? Is it predictable? And do the contextual influences stop at the home? Are there contextual influences that have far-reaching influences on children and their families, well beyond what we might immediately think of? How do we explain and understand the complex interactions and relationships that coalesce between children and their families and the communities in which they live, and the impact that this can have on overall child development? If you had to explain why our communities and families work the way that they do, could you? Most people would struggle to do this, and that's understandable. It's complex thinking. However, Bronfenbrenner's theory has provided us with a really simple and easy to understand roadmap to help identify the influences and the forces at work that come together, that pull together to help explain the complex interactions and relationships that shape the ways in which children grow and are situated within their families and how they actually all situate within their communities. Yuri Bronfenbrenner was born in 1917 in Russia and is the theorist who developed the ecological systems theory that is a good chunk of the first part of your chapter in your set text. His theory explains the complexity of children's development in terms of the interplay and interactions between the person and the environment. His theory also puts a lens across that and recognises that some child characteristics and context of childhood may not only present risks to child development, but also contribute to protective factors for child outcomes. His theory also presents a really handy zoom in, zoom out lens that's really helpful in understanding the indirect influences that are at play in child development. This is really particularly relevant when we begin to consider the role of public policy that is often crafted and enacted by people well beyond the close relationships of family, friends, and extended families. His model, that we're going to have a closer look at in the next slide, is presented within a theory that places a child at the centre of the model, with concentric or nested circles of influence described as we move further away from the child. The overarching premise is that the circles or the nested aspects of the model that are closer to the centre of the model have a more direct influence and impact on child development. However, it's really important to note that while the outer layers of the model have a much more indirect influence, they're no less powerful to shape the lived experiences of children in the everyday and their families and the communities in which they live. So on your screen, you can see the model of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, and you can see that it's comprised of concentric layers of influence. And if we begin in the middle, where the child is situated at the centre of the model, his model consists of the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, the macrosystem, and the chronosystem. And I'm just going to take a brief moment on each of those aspects of the model to unpack what sort of influences are at play in each of those respective layers. As we begin to consider Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, a notable aspect that I want to draw your attention to in this model was his focus on understanding what he calls proximal processes, and these are the processes that support children's development. These processes are the processes that directly lead to a child's growth and development and capture the direct activities and interactions between child and somebody else. It is the proximal processes that Bronfenbrenner asserts influence direct learning. So the positive relationships with educators at childcare or school can enhance children's development through direct processes, but may also serve to buffer children from potential negative impact from poor parent-child relationships outside of the schools. Influences that don't rely on this closeness, this proximal processes aspect, have a more indirect influence on the learning and development for a child. So a really simple example of this is, let's imagine that a teacher is actively engaged in supporting a young child to explore literacy. That's a proximal process that has direct influence on the child's educative experience. So her actually working with a child to learn how to recognise names or to read a book is an interaction and a relationship between the teacher and the child that guides the direct learning of the child. However, if we just step back from that immediate process, that proximal process, and consider that the resources of the books or the materials to write with, the curriculum itself that's been established through public policy, and even the employment of the teacher, are all aspects that coalesce together to assist the teacher to directly teach the child. And these processes, while not proximal, in fact are distal and are still very influential on the end output that happens for the child. Of course, these processes are not limited to the school context at all, but capture all of the activities and interactions that children actually learn from. So let's take another simple example. Let's imagine that a child is engaged in sport on the weekend, and the parents believe this is a worthwhile activity to teach children all those great things about sport, like getting on with others and healthy competition and physical activity, etc. The proximal processes in this example include things like the interaction with teammates and football coaches and, of course, parents. However, the broader influences to support those proximal activities include things like the parental employment to support the cost of attending sport, the local government's ability to build and maintain sporting fields, and the community's ability to establish a sporting club. These are all necessary to support the lived experience of a child playing football on the weekend. With these two examples, you can begin to see the complex interplay with proximal and distal processes and the manner in which they coalesce to influence the everyday lived experience and development outcomes for children. The first level of Bronfenbrenner's model that we'll explore a little bit more is that of the microsystem. The microsystem describes the face-to-face relationships and interactions between the individual child in the middle of the nested system and those with the most direct influence. And these include people, obviously family, extended family, friends, things like people in the schools and childcare, religious affiliations such as pastors and imams and priests, and those other people that form a part of the child's inner circle in the neighbourhoods. Of course, it's really not difficult to see the influence that these most direct structures and people can have on a child. And at this level, it's also very easy to understand the important role of those proximate processes on the learning and development that children are able to access and engage with, and ultimately that shape child development. The second layer of Bronfenbrenner's model that I want to discuss with you is that of the mesosystem. And it's really quite an interesting part of the model because it describes the congruence or the disconnection between the people and the setting in the child's microsystem. Your text explains that child development is going to be influenced by the degree of matching values and behaviours and expectations between people within that microsystem for the child. So if we think about a really simple explanation or example to show you how the mesosystems work, let's consider two children. One child who comes from a family whose values and beliefs really strongly align to that of the child's teacher and the school's philosophy. Here, the matching between those two really important groups of people in the child's microsystem is likely to be quite strong and positive. Conversely, if we think of another child attending the same school, but this child's family's values differ to that of the school's or to the teachers, in this circumstance, it's quite possible that there's a disconnection between those two really important groups of people in this child's microsystem. And this disconnection or lack of congruence is likely to have a negative potential impact on the child's overall lived experience of being at school or in a childcare setting. However, it's also really important to note that not all children who have less than an optimal experience have less than optimal outcomes. And I'm quite sure you can think of some reasons why children and families cope and thrive in spite of adversity, while others seem to be severely affected. Why do you think this might be so? Well, it sort of speaks to the degree of risk or the protective factors within a child's context that will either exacerbate or ameliorate adverse influences. So, for example, risk factors such as parental mental health, poverty, and child abuse are all risk factors that can diminish a child's ability to cope with certain circumstances. Alternatively, we know that a nurturing and loving home environment can be a protective factor despite harsh environmental influences. So where there is a disconnect in the mesosystem, these protective factors can actually really be beneficial for children to soften the lived experience and ultimately the outcomes that children will develop. Moving on to the exosystem, that describes the settings that children are not directly engaged with, yet have a very indirect and noticeable influence on overall child development, and includes things like parental working conditions, local service provision for families from local governments, such as access to housing, public transport, all of those sorts of things, all have an impact on the family unit, which in turn has an impact on their child's development. So if we think back to the football example, consider what might have been the impact if the state government ceased funding local sporting bodies with funds to build a new clubhouse, or the local council decided to rezone the footy field to become a new housing development, or perhaps the local club merged with a club 10 kilometres away and the home ground moved to the new location. Or perhaps a change to the state government saw new funds flowing into the sporting club to expand the work that they were undertaking. Any and all of these things in the exosystem will impact, for better or worse, the lived experiences of children. Decisions made by adults in these government and community organisations will affect children and families that they'll never meet. The effect may not be immediate, but the effect is pretty powerful. Moving towards the outer layer of the model, we come to the macrosystem. And the macrosystem refers to the broad societal and cultural contexts that have impact across all other systems in the model. This influences include things like cultural belief systems, societal structures, including things such as religious institutions and overarching government structures and social infrastructure. The macro system also produces things like governing laws, funding budgets, and generalised constructed and reconstructed cultural values and beliefs, traditions and social norms. The influence that the macro system has on the individual child is quite indirect, as you can imagine, but no less powerful. It is overarching, persistent, and pervasive, and effects here take much longer to impact on children and families, but the effect can be quite substantial and far-reaching. The final layer of the model is that of the chronosystem, and the chronosystem relates to the socio-historical conditions and influences that underpin our current context. In previous lecturettes, we've spoken about the historical positioning of children in a Euro-Western culture. The micro, meso, exo, and macro systems that were in play represented the context of a given day. The social changes that occur over time and the changes to the fabric of society that in turn shapes the proximal and distal processes within each layer of the model are continually in process. For example, consider the social norms of the 19th and 20th century for women to stay at home and rear children. The exo and macro systems of the day would not have had to consider provisions for such things as maternity leave or childcare provisions for working parents, and that was relevant for the time. But if we fast forward to 29 and all of these distal processes, the considerations are a normal part of how our society works in Australia today. It didn't happen overnight, and the influences from the chronosystem have been at play and continues to exert an ever-changing influence on our contemporary communities and the children and families who live there. As we continue to explore this unit of study, I encourage you to frame your considerations against Bronfenbrenner's model. If we consider critical theory for just a moment, this model also speaks to the way in which power relationships are constituted. Consider who has the power in each level of the model, whose voice is heard and whose is silenced, and whose is marginalised and who is celebrated. This model, at first glance, defines a unidirectional view, that is, the influences feed down to the child. But if we start to consider whose voice is marginalised and who is celebrated, there's also space for us to consider how children might influence up and out of their model, and what sort of influence they can exert on their own systems, on their microsystem and the mesosystem, and in fact the exosystem, and in contemporary communities, even to the macro system. These are all really good critical points to reflect on as you consider an underpinning theory that explains how our contemporary children and families and communities actually work. In our next lecturette, we're going to begin exploring our next topic, and that is researching with and about children and the use of big data to inform policy and practice. Please read the pre-reads, and I look forward to sharing time with you again soon.